And welcome back to The Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am, as always, Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy, although most folks know me as Bob the Wizard. And I am a pure and open channel for the finest vibrations of divine love and light, made manifest here, in service to Gaia and those who travel with her. In my last little video, I was waxing lyrical about the birth of my second daughter and life and times in the forest, and I did make mention that this one would be about ground truth, but don't just make this up as we go along. The aim of my channel little project was to share the book that I was finding so difficult to write. So I do have a quick little flick through my notes just to see if I've missed any exciting stories from the forest, and I had missed a couple. Firefighting and forest days. So one of the joys of working on the training area was of course being there all year. During the winter, quite often if we were a dry patch, the fire risk on the forest can go up. And we were careful every year to make sure that all the signage was out and that all users were briefed not to use pyrotechnics, no open fires, in order to keep the fire risk down. Well, I don't want to be rude, but squaddies are squaddies. They tend to listen sagely, say yes, and then do what they want to do. On my first mini-fire, having bravely came up and informed the users that they weren't to be using smoke grenades, one of the instructors decided to demonstrate at the very least. At the end of the day, he'd bought them all, they were his toys and he wanted to spend them. His plan was to throw them up on top of the road. They'd burn out, no risk, no problem. And carefully addressing his class, he stood there to demonstrate how to use a smoke. Pulled the pin, threw it over his shoulder, expecting it to land on the road. Of course it had bounced and rolled into a very dry patch of bracken. So, vaguely reminiscent of my own memories of emerging from a demolitions pit down at Hereford. He was seen talking to the class with a wall of fire building behind him. Thankfully there was a lot of people there, so they managed to get onto the fire and it was small and contained. But these little fires were a regular part of life on the training area. Occasionally these things would get out of hand. The biggest fire that I ever experienced on the forest was a day much like today, probably why it's come back to mind. Clear blue skies, but it was a lot windier. As usual, having ignored their instruction, a group had gone off to do a section attack up a hill under the cover of smoke, assuming that they picked green patches carefully to let the smoke off in, they'd be fine. And yet again, one of them had rolled. In trying to fight the fire in front of them, the group hadn't seen the fire was building behind them, and this quite literally started to take on epic proportions. At the time I was on the opposite side of the site. I saw the smoke go up, and as part of my duties I duly beetled off, fire beater in hand, basically a huge stick with a big rubber flap on the end, ready to make an attempt to hold the fire while calling in the brigade. By the time I hit the top of the hill, it was clear that it was slightly beyond a fire beater. The house had phoned me and the brigade, and the fire service was turning up in numbers. It then became a marshalling game. At the time, one of the users on the forest was on that heath, cutting wood, in his tractor and forest trailer. Thankfully, he was seen literally driving away from the fire to park up by the side of the lakes, in the hope that the fire wouldn't reach the wetter ground at the bottom. By now, this was starting to look like something out of a film set, just a wall of fire across the heath, accompanied by the occasional crack and pop of discarded blank rounds, but with pyrotechnics in. Now as the fire built, more crews, and I ended up talking to a fireman with a white hat, with an awful lot more bands than I was used to seeing on it. It was clear that this was the chap I was supposed to be standing next to, while we were at the top of the hill directing where he could move his vehicles. Where there were parts of the ground where I knew from my own experience of getting vehicles stuck, he probably didn't ought to drive. Well, the middle of the heathland was pretty much sacrificed. and efforts were made to try and contain the fire. It really did look for a moment as if it could jump the borders. We had members of Ashdown Forest, thanks for that, guys, still remember it, literally turning up. Can we help? What's that? Because otherwise this is going to be a huge problem. So I was standing with the fire chief, assuring him that the range had been burnt over a number of times, and that while in World War II, in its long history, it had been used as a live training area, it was just blanks. There was nothing to worry about. It was an old World War II grenade range where folk would practice. Again, thankfully, by talking to the landowner and his father, I knew that years ago it had burned itself out, so it was safe. Nothing, no future actions, unless you dug there, of course. Well, having just assured him that there was no major problem, somebody had obviously hidden a large box of belt ammunition for a machine gun. This started to cook off, and it literally was going off like a firecracker. There were bits of metal pinging around, raining down on us as we beat a hasty retreat to the next fire break, where the fire was eventually stopped. Now, I'll be honest, on returning in the morning, my job of picking litter on the heath was certainly very easy. It was all black. So I had a good walk for several days, smelling of smoke, picking up discarded smokes from previous exercises that hadn't set fire to the heath. It was a good opportunity to really clear the land, and it's going to sound strange, but fire's been used on Ashdown and heathlands for generations, still used as part of more ethnic rural practice of burning the land to re-stimulate growth. Well, I actually got a chance to watch this in action. Really was what started off as what looked like a black desert, carefully picked over the course of a few weeks, then the months, greened up, and literally watched the heath re-establish itself. It became prime grazing ground, and in many ways replicated what used to happen on Ashdown, which was, of course, a common land where people grazed. So this was a practice. And the fire risk was less in those days because everybody took all the bracken away as bedding for animals. Brings me to an interesting point from a conversation today, that in many ways the natural landscapes, as wild and as beautiful as they are early industrial landscapes that we're now living in, that have rewilded as nature takes back what was once hers. One of the joys of being a warden and working in nature. Anyway, great fires aside, I did have one little further tale of the wildlife and the effect that country life can have on certain folks. Now, over the years we hosted a number of youth groups, some of which were from youth offender schemes, big, tough London lads and lasses. They certainly came onto the site with an attitude, but generally one night out, and it's amazing how a night under the open skies with no streetlights can really change the most brave of streetwise kids. If it gave them an experience of nature, the aim was to re-anchor them into a reality, not the computer world, not urban life and what we make of life, but a natural reality. In many ways, it certainly helps us all. While great fires aside, as I've mentioned, or possibly mentioned, I did of course have staff. My staff were, of course, four-legged, and they were Exmoor ponies. Occasionally the little darlings would escape, somebody would leave a gate open, and rounding them up was always fun. But for the most part they stayed put, and they did a phenomenal job. They eat, keep the grass down, their footfall opens up the ground for pioneer species. They're a natural part of the environment, and grazing projects across heathland is a grand way of keeping these heaths in the condition that they should be. Now, they were fine, my staff, provided of course that you didn't try and feed them. While they seemed quite peaceful, these were wild ponies, and they would fight for an apple core, a discarded apple thrown. That, along with the badgers and the foxes, were a constant bane for anybody camping out, if they left a bag out overnight, their carefully litter-picked area would be strewn with rubbish, quite often on account of Sid, the squirrel, while he sought out his sugar thrush. Anyway, my ponies, the ponies, hardly mine, did have a habit of rubbing up and chewing at vehicles. Like all young animals, they had a thing for windscreen wipers. And they've wrecked a few cars in their time. Well, at least eaten the windscreen wipers. Now on the Centurion film set, as I mentioned, a set had been built. Now film sets look amazing. So on the screen it just looked real. But the reality these days is big curtains with green screens and small pieces of set. From the front it looked like the entranceway to the start of Hadrian's Wall. From the back it was just scaffolding. The joys of Hollywood. But of course the ponies, being ponies in the night, had decided that this was an ideal rubbing spot. They also decided to see what the film set tasted like. Now, film sets leave security guards just to make sure that nobody's climbing on it. The usual things, keep the set preserved. Most nights I had a usual guy and I'd catch up with them every morning. I arrived to find a different car and a different security guard. In his sleeping bag, in the car, eyes like saucers. I tapped on the window. "Are you all right, mate?" And in a very London accent he announced that he'd had the night from hell. It started off when he'd gone out for a wee and he'd heard the most bizarre, whirling, churning noise. Did I know what it was? Tapping my nose sagely, I said, "Oh yes, that will be the goat suckers." At which point he looked even more terrified. I then had to tell him that was just a local name for nightjars. No beautiful birds, and they wouldn't harm anyone. The ponies had taken a liking to his car, and every time the poor bugger had tried to get to sleep, one of them would be bumping up against the side of the car in the dark. And he'd had a deeply unpleasant night. It was also the first time that he genuinely turned and said, "No idea it got so dark in the UK." While it's not a true dark sky area, there's a lot of towns around. It's unpopulated in comparison to where, certainly compared to the cities. I have to say, as cruel as it may sound, having achieved such a wonderful hook with the goat suckers, he then scurried out of the car for another wee. Giving him his decency and turning my back, he was away in the bushes and said, "Well, at least we don't have such things as snakes." At which point I pointed out that on a fresh morning like this, it wouldn't be unusual that he might be weeing on an adder. And assured him that we do indeed have 3 species of snakes in the UK, to which he became even more nervous and then mentioned spiders. Now, how was I to know that showing him a picture of a wasp spider and a newcomer, relative newcomer to our shores? And I have to say that when I first saw one, they are quite terrifying. They are big spiders, and what they eat are grasshoppers. I have a fantastic picture of it. Although it was quite intimidating to take the picture, but lying very close, with a close lens, of this magnificent spider in her intricate web. Well, anyway, the next day, the other security guard was back on, and apparently the guy refused point blank to come back on set, and he was staying in Pinewood and never leaving again. So, to that poor security guard for winding you up, even though you'll never see this, you have my apologies. Once again, the purpose of this tale is to share some happy, joyous times of a wonderful time in my life. And in sharing, I hope that it reminds you of some of the wonderful and joyous times in your life. And without further ado, in my next little episode, I will go on to talk about ground truth. Take care, go well, and blessed be.